Welcome, time traveler. Tonight, you won't find knights or kings. You'll find flickering candles, whispered deals, and the creak of beds behind thin wooden walls. In medieval cities, brothels weren't just dens of pleasure. They were machines of money, tools of control, and sometimes the only path to survival. But what really happened inside? What did the girls endure? Who profited? And why did the church secretly protect it all? Let's step inside the velvet dark corridors of medieval brothels and uncover the truth's history. Try to hide. You're walking through the narrow, fetid streets of 14th century Paris when a woman in a scarlet hood beckons you toward a wooden door marked with a white glove. The symbol means nothing to you now, but in medieval Europe, it was as recognizable as a McDonald's golden arch today. You're about to enter a world that the church condemned, the state regulated, and society desperately needed. Yet no one dared speak its name aloud. Medieval brothels weren't seedy back-alley operations hidden from view. They were legitimate businesses, licensed by kings, blessed by mayors, and strategically placed in the heart of every major city in Avignon. The papal brothels operated under direct church supervision in London. The Southwark stews were owned by the Bishop of Winchester himself, earning them the nickname Winchester geese for the women who worked there. But here's what will shatter everything you think you know about medieval morality. These establishments weren't just tolerated. They were considered essential for social order. City councils didn't just permit prostitution. They mandated it. In 1254, King Louis IX of France tried to ban prostitution entirely. Within 2 years, rape and adultery rates soared so dramatically that his successors reversed the ban and began licensing brothels as a matter of public safety. The woman in the scarlet hood isn't just inviting you into a building. She's pulling you into a parallel universe, where virtue and vice dance together in ways that would make modern society's head spin. The church that preached chastity collected taxes from prostitutes. The same city fathers who attended morning mass appointed official brothel inspectors by afternoon. You hesitate at the threshold, and the woman's eyes glint with something between amusement and pity. She knows what you don't yet understand. You're not entering a den of sin, but a carefully regulated institution, as structured as any guild, as hierarchical as any cathedral, and as essential to medieval life as the market square or the monastery. But what waits beyond that door will challenge everything you believe about the Middle Ages, about sexuality, about power, and about survival. The scarlet-hooded woman steps aside, and you realize you have no choice but to enter. Because in medieval Europe, these places weren't optional luxuries. They were necessary evils that kept an entire civilization from tearing itself apart. The wooden door creaks open, and you step into a world where nothing is as it seems. You find yourself in the reception hall of a municipal brothel in 15th century Dijon, and what strikes you first isn't the expected squalor. It's the bureaucracy. A clerk sits at a polished oak desk, meticulously recording entries in a leather-bound ledger. Every transaction, every visitor, every woman who works here is documented with the precision of a tax collector because, in essence, that's exactly what this is. Medieval cities didn't just tolerate prostitution, they institutionalized it. The municipal brothel system operated like any other civic service. In Toulouse, the city council appointed a brothel keeper the same way they appointed a harbor master or bridge warden. These weren't criminal enterprises. They were municipal monopolies designed to control, contain, and profit from an inevitable aspect of human nature. The regulations were staggeringly detailed. In Nuremberg, city ordinances specified that brothel windows must remain shuttered during religious holidays, that no woman could work while menstruating, and that the establishment must close entirely during Lent. Brothel keepers were required to post bonds, submit to regular inspections, and maintain detailed records of their workers' health, earnings, and personal histories. You watch as a new woman arrives, perhaps 15 years old, clutching a small bundle of possessions. The clerk examines her papers, proof of age, a medical certificate, and most importantly, documentation that she's not married, not a nun, and not from a respectable family. The medieval world had strict rules about who could become a prostitute, and they weren't what you might expect in most cities. Married women were strictly forbidden from sex work, not out of moral concern, but because it would compromise male property rights. Similarly, daughters of citizens were off limits, creating a two-tiered system where only the most vulnerable, immigrants, orphans, and the desperately poor, fed this machine. The clerk stamps her papers and hands her a metal token, her license to work. In Augsburg, these tokens had to be renewed monthly. In Florence, they included detailed physical descriptions to prevent counterfeiting. You're witnessing the birth of regulated sex work, complete with licensing fees, health inspections, and municipal oversight. But there's something chilling about this efficiency. This reduction of human desperation to ledger entries and filing systems. The young woman clutches her token, and you see in her eyes the moment she realizes she's just become municipal property. What price would anyone, ultimately pay for this protection? You're holding a prostitute's wage slip from 1423 Strasbourg, and the numbers tell a story more complex than any moral sermon. She earned 3 deniers per customer, exactly the daily wage of a laborer, but she could see 6 to 8 customers per day. On paper, she was making more than skilled craftsmen, but the mathematics of medieval prostitution were designed to ensure she'd never escape. The economic structure was ingeniously exploitative. The brothel keeper took half her earnings as rent for her tiny chamber. The city claimed another 15% as licensing fees. She had to purchase her food from the brothel kitchen at inflated prices, her clothing from approved vendors who charged premium rates, and her cosmetics from the house supplier who watered down the products. But here's the detail that reveals the true genius of the system. Medieval prostitutes were required to dress luxuriously. In Regensburg, city law mandated that working women wear silk and gold trim, not as a privilege, but as a financial trap. These expensive garments had to be purchased from licensed merchants at prices that ensured most women remained perpetually in debt to the brothel keeper. You watch as our young woman from the previous scene receives her weekly accounting. She's earned 36 deniers this week, a fortune by peasant standards. But after the brothel keeper's cut, city taxes, mandatory, clothing purchases, cosmetic expenses, and inflated food costs, she's left with 4 deniers. Barely enough for a loaf of bread. The debt system was specifically designed to prevent escape. In Munich's municipal records from 1472, the average working woman owed the equivalent of 18 months' wages to her brothel keeper. Since leaving without paying debts was illegal, most remained trapped for life. The few who saved enough to buy their freedom typically did so by becoming brothel keepers themselves, perpetuating the cycle. Medieval cities had discovered something that modern economists would recognize. Creating artificial scarcity and mandatory expenses could transform even high-earning workers into economic prisoners. The women weren't just selling their bodies. They were trapped in a system of financial servitude disguised as entrepreneurship. You notice the young woman's hands shake as she signs her name to acknowledge the debt. She can read unusual for someone in her position, which means she understands exactly how the numbers conspire against her. But what you haven't seen yet is how the church justified its role in this mathematical exploitation. You're standing in the office of the Bishop of Winchester in 1487, watching him review profit reports from the Southern brothels. The same man who delivered Sunday sermons about chastity and virtue is examining ledgers that detail the earnings from 12 licensed houses of prostitution. This isn't hypocrisy. It's medieval theology in action. The Church's relationship with prostitution followed the doctrine of tolerating the lesser evil. St. Augustine himself had argued that removing prostitutes from society would be like taking sewers out of a palace. Everything would become polluted with lust. St. Thomas Aquinas refined this argument, claiming that brothels prevented the greater sins of adultery and rape. In the medieval mind, prostitution wasn't just tolerated by divine will, it was required by it. Church-owned brothels operated throughout Europe. In Avignon, the papal brothels were so profitable that Pope Sixtus IV used the proceeds to fund the construction of the Sistine Chapel. The irony would be lost on no one. Some of history's greatest religious art was literally paid for by prostitution. In Toulouse, the church owned the most luxurious brothel in the city, complete with silk hangings and imported wine. But the theological justification went deeper than mere tolerance. Medieval churchmen argued that prostitutes served a sacred function by absorbing the lustful impulses that would otherwise corrupt virtuous women. They were seen as a kind of human sin-eater, taking on the sexual transgressions of society to preserve the purity of wives and daughters. You watch as the bishop examines a request from one of his brothel keepers for permission to expand. The woman, for most keepers were women, presents architectural plans, financial projections, and testimonials from city councilmen. This is a business presentation that would fit comfortably in any modern corporate boardroom. The bishop's approval comes with conditions: mandatory chapel attendance for all workers, confession twice weekly, and substantial donations to the church's charity funds. The women who sold their bodies were also required to save their souls through regulated piety. The church had created a system where sin and salvation were literally housed under the same roof. But here's the detail that reveals the true sophistication of medieval theological doublethink. These same church authorities maintained detailed records proving that many prostitutes were more literate, better educated, and more financially sophisticated than the average medieval woman. How did society reconcile the obvious intelligence and capability of these women with their supposed moral degradation? You're witnessing something unprecedented in medieval Europe. A prostitutes' guild meeting in 1445. Valencia. 23 women sit in a circle, discussing working conditions, wage disputes, and collective bargaining with brothel keepers. This isn't what you expected from the world's oldest profession. It's organized labor, complete with elected representatives, written contracts, and strike negotiations. Medieval prostitutes weren't passive victims. They organized with the same sophistication as any craft guild. In Cologne, the Society of Women of Joy maintained a guild hall, elected officers, and negotiated collectively with city authorities. They established minimum wages, maximum working hours, and protocols for handling difficult customers. Members who violated guild rules faced fines, suspension, or expulsion, the same disciplinary measures used by goldsmiths or weavers. The Valencia Guild you're observing has just voted to strike against a brothel keeper who's been skimming wages. Their leader, a woman named Catalina, who's worked the trade for 12 years, presents their demands with the precision of a trained lawyer. She cites specific city ordinances, references precedents from other guilds, and threatens to appeal directly to the municipal council if their demands aren't met. These women understood power in ways that would impress modern union organizers. They knew that their services were essential to social order, and they weren't afraid to leverage that knowledge. In 1469, the prostitutes of Dijon actually did go on strike, closing all the city's licensed brothels for 6 weeks. The resulting chaos, fights in taverns, disturbances in the streets, complaints from merchants about unruly customers, forced city authorities to intervene on the women's behalf. But guild membership came with obligations beyond mere economics. You watch as Catalina reviews the guild's charitable commitments, supporting members who were too sick to work, providing dowries for women who wanted to leave the profession, and maintaining a fund for proper burials. These women had created their own social safety net in a world that offered them none. The most surprising revelation comes when Catalina produces the guild's educational curriculum. Members were required to learn basic accounting, contract law, and even rudimentary Latin. The guild maintained its own lending library and hired tutors for illiterate members. Medieval prostitutes were often more educated than merchants. Wives, you realize you're not watching victims organizing for survival. You're witnessing businesswomen professionalizing their industry. But what you haven't yet discovered is how this professionalization would ultimately seal their fate. You're learning the unwritten curriculum that every medieval prostitute had to master, the deadly art of reading men's souls in the flicker of candlelight. In a chamber in 1456, Brussels, an experienced woman named Marguerite teaches a newcomer the skills that mean the difference between life and death. This isn't about seduction. It's about psychological warfare disguised as intimacy. Medieval prostitutes developed survival techniques that would impress modern intelligence operatives. They learned to identify dangerous customers within seconds of meeting them. A man who avoided eye contact while negotiating price was likely violent. Someone who asked detailed questions about the building's layout was probably planning theft or worse. A customer who insisted on complete darkness was hiding weapons, scars, or intentions. Marguerite demonstrates the chamber scan, a systematic, visual inventory completed while appearing to arrange her clothing seductively. She locates potential weapons, identifies escape routes, and assesses the customer's physical condition and sobriety level. This evaluation happens in under 30 seconds, disguised as coquettish preparation. The women developed their own coded language. In Nuremberg, prostitutes use specific terms to warn each other about dangerous customers. A man described as having cold hands was violent. Someone with heavy purse paid well but was likely diseased. A customer with kind eyes seemed safe but was probably married to someone powerful, making him dangerous in a different way. But the most sophisticated survival skill was emotional manipulation. You watch as Marguerite demonstrates how to make each customer feel like the only man in the world while maintaining complete psychological distance. She teaches the newcomer to create artificial intimacy, memorizing personal details, feigning interest in their problems, making each encounter feel like a romantic connection rather than a commercial transaction. The psychological toll was managed through a system of mental compartmentalization that bordered on dissociation. Experienced women spoke of their working self as a completely separate person, someone who could endure anything while protecting their true self hidden deep inside. This wasn't just survival. It was a form of psychological architecture designed to preserve sanity. Medieval brothels were finishing schools for emotional intelligence. The women who survived learned to read micro-expressions, manipulate conversations, and navigate complex social hierarchies with skills that would make modern diplomats envious. But survival came at a price that wouldn't become clear until much later. You're standing in the private chamber of a medieval brothel physician in 1467 Paris, watching him examine a woman using medical techniques that wouldn't be out of place in a modern clinic. Medieval prostitutes received better health care than most of the population, not out of compassion, but because their bodies were valuable municipal assets that required maintenance. Dr. Philippe de Montcornet keeps detailed medical records that reveal the sophisticated understanding medieval physicians had developed about sexually transmitted diseases. His treatments for what they called the French disease, syphilis, though they didn't know the name, included mercury ointments, herbal preparations, and dietary restrictions that actually showed some effectiveness. Medieval brothel medicine was generations ahead of general medical practice. But the most startling discovery in his records isn't about disease treatment. It's about birth control. Medieval prostitutes had access to contraceptive, knowledge that was systematically hidden from married women. Dr. Montcornet's notes describe pessaries made from honey and crocodile dung, herbal teas that prevented conception, and insertion techniques for barrier methods made from animal membranes. The pregnancy prevention rate among medieval prostitutes was remarkably high, around 80%, according to surviving records. This wasn't luck. It was sophisticated reproductive medicine practiced in secret. The church officially condemned contraception, but municipal authorities quietly ensured that prostitutes had access to it because pregnant sex workers were bad for business. You examine his surgical instruments, crude by modern standards, but effective for the procedures he performed. Medieval brothel physicians routinely performed what we would recognize as minor gynecological surgery, treating infections, removing growths, and repairing injuries. They also performed cosmetic procedures, removing scars, whitening teeth, and even primitive plastic surgery to repair facial damage. The most disturbing entries in Dr. Montcornet's records detail the systematic medical abuse disguised as healthcare. Young women were sometimes deliberately infected with mild venereal diseases to build immunity against more serious ones. Others underwent procedures to artificially restore their virginity for customers who paid premium prices for the illusion of innocence. Medieval prostitutes were medical test subjects, but they were also the beneficiaries of cutting-edge healthcare that most people couldn't access. Their bodies became laboratories where medieval physicians developed treatments that would eventually benefit all of society. But what you're about to discover is how this medical knowledge became a weapon against the women it was supposed to protect. You're holding the baptismal records from St. Mary Church in 1489 Paris, and the entries tell a story that medieval society tried desperately to hide. Listed among the legitimate births are dozens of children whose mothers are identified only as de joie, of joy, the euphemism for prostitutes. These children existed in a legal and social limbo that medieval Europe had no idea how to navigate. The children of prostitutes weren't automatically bastards. Medieval law was more complex than that. If the mother could name a father and he acknowledged paternity, the child could inherit property and bear the father's name. But most prostitutes strategically refused to name fathers, knowing that doing so would expose their children to worse discrimination than remaining officially fatherless. You discover that many of these children were raised collectively in the fireplace brothel communities. The women created their own kinship networks, with childless prostitutes becoming aunts and godmothers to their colleagues' offspring. Medieval brothels often functioned as extended families, providing the emotional support that biological families denied these women. But here's the detail that reveals the true complexity of medieval social structures. Many of these children received excellent educations. Prostitutes understood that knowledge was the only inheritance they could guarantee their children. The literacy rate among brothel-raised children was significantly higher than the general population. They learned languages, mathematics, and practical skills that prepared them for legitimate careers. The records show that sons of prostitutes often became clerks, scribes, or entered religious orders, careers that required literacy but didn't demand proof of legitimate birth. Daughters faced more limited options, but many became successful merchants, innkeepers, or married into respectable families by carefully concealing their origins. Some children chose to remain in the brothel world, but not as prostitutes. They became bookkeepers, security guards, or brothel keepers themselves. They understood the business from childhood and could navigate its complexities better than outsiders. The prostitution industry created its own hereditary class of administrators and managers. You notice marginal notes in the church records indicating that several children listed as de joie later achieved remarkable success. One became a university professor, another a wealthy merchant, and one daughter of a Parisian prostitute eventually married into minor nobility by successfully hiding her origins. But what happened when society finally decided these children and their mothers had to be controlled? You're watching a medieval fashion police raid in 1423 Augsburg, and the target isn't thieves or smugglers. It's prostitutes wearing the wrong colors. Municipal authorities are literally measuring hem lengths, examining fabric quality, and confiscating jewelry from women whose crime was dressing above their designated social station. Medieval Europe waged a centuries-long war against prostitutes through sumptuary laws that controlled every thread they wore. The clothing regulations for prostitutes were obsessively detailed. In Florence, sex workers were required to wear yellow as a mark of their profession. In France, they had to display red badges. In Vienna, prostitutes couldn't wear silk, fur, or precious metals. In Milan, they were forbidden from wearing veils or covering their heads in public. These weren't fashion guidelines. They were legal requirements enforced with fines, imprisonment, and physical punishment. But the women fought back with creativity that would impress any fashion rebel. They discovered legal loopholes. If yellow was required, they chose the most beautiful saffron yellow available and wore it with such style that it became fashionable among respectable women. When red badges were mandated, they commissioned jewelers to create beautiful brooches that incorporated the required color while making bold fashion statements. The clothing wars revealed the deep anxiety medieval society felt about prostitutes' economic success. Many sex workers earned enough to afford luxurious clothing that rivaled what noble women wore. The sumptuary laws weren't really about morality. They were about maintaining visible class distinctions that economics had begun to blur. You watch as a prostitute named Agnes is arrested for wearing a silk gown without the required yellow trim. But the arresting officer seems embarrassed by his duty. The gown is clearly expensive and beautifully made. Agnes carries herself with the confidence of a successful businesswoman. The only thing marking her as a prostitute is the absence of a small yellow ribbon, a legal technicality that suddenly seems absurd. Medieval court records reveal that clothing violations were among the most commonly prosecuted crimes involving prostitutes. Women were fined, imprisoned, and publicly humiliated for wearing the wrong fabric or color. The state devoted enormous resources to controlling what these women wore, suggesting that their appearance threatened something fundamental about medieval social order. The most revealing aspect of these clothing laws was their inconsistency. What was forbidden in one city was required in another. The arbitrary nature of the regulations suggests they were less about marking prostitutes for public safety than about asserting governmental control over women who had achieved unexpected economic independence. But the clothing wars were just the beginning of a larger campaign that contained these women's growing power. You're standing on the Pont Saint-Michel in 1475 Paris, looking down at the Seine's south bank where the city's prostitution district spreads like a small nation with its own laws, customs, and government. Medieval cities didn't just tolerate red light districts. They designed them with the precision of urban planners, creating contained worlds that functioned as safety valves for society's contradictions. The spatial organization wasn't accidental. Prostitution districts were typically located near water for sanitation, close to city walls for easy access by travelers, and adjacent to markets where customers naturally gathered. But they were also positioned to be easily sealed off if necessary. Medieval authorities understood that controlling space meant controlling behavior. In Southwark, London's famous red light district, the geography told the story of English pragmatism. The area was technically outside London's city limits, allowing officials to claim they weren't permitting vice while collecting taxes from it. The district had its own courts, its own bailiffs, and its own peculiar laws. Customers who didn't pay their bills could be imprisoned in local jails. Violence against prostitutes was punished more severely than similar crimes elsewhere. You descend into the narrow streets and discover a parallel universe. The brothels aren't the squalid shacks you expected, but substantial buildings, many 3 or 4 stories tall. Some feature elaborate painted signs advertising their specialties. Others display coats of arms indicating their municipal licensing. The architecture itself reveals the economic importance of the trade. The most sophisticated districts developed their own service economies. You encounter barbers who specialized in treating venereal diseases, bathhouses with discreetly separate entrances, and taverns that catered specifically to the post-transaction social needs of customers. Money changers operated openly, converting foreign currency for traveling merchants. Scribes offered letter-writing services for illiterate customers who wanted to communicate with lovers in distant cities. But the geography also revealed the fundamental instability of these arrangements. Medieval prostitution districts were simultaneously inside and outside normal society. They were licensed by authorities, but remained legally precarious. They generated substantial tax revenue, but existed at the mercy of changing political winds. District locations made them vulnerable in ways their inhabitants were just beginning to understand. Positioned near city walls, they would be the first areas sacrificed during sieges. Located near water, they flooded regularly, destroying property and disrupting business. Placed outside official city limits, they could be abandoned or relocated, whenever convenient for authorities. What no one realized was that this geographical marginalization was preparing the ground for something much worse. You're reading a letter dated 1456 from a Venetian prostitute to her sister working in a London brothel, and you realize you've discovered evidence of medieval Europe's first international business network. These women weren't isolated victims. They were part of a continent-spanning communication system that moved information, money, and people across borders with efficiency that rivaled any merchant guild. The letter contains detailed intelligence about working conditions, wage rates, and legal changes in different cities. Medieval prostitutes maintained an informal intelligence network that kept them informed about opportunities and dangers across Europe. A woman in Bruges knew within weeks when authorities in Naples changed their licensing requirements. News of a plague outbreak in Cologne reached the brothels of Seville before it reached most government officials. You discover that prostitutes traveled more than almost any other group in medieval society. Italian women worked seasons in German cities before returning home. French women sought opportunities in Flemish ports. English women traveled to Calais for the higher wages paid to exotic foreigners. This mobility required sophisticated logistical support, safe houses, currency exchange, legal documentation, and protection networks. The international network wasn't just about business. It was about survival. Women who became too well known in one city could relocate to another. Those who saved enough money could reinvent themselves entirely in distant locations. The network provided escape routes that medieval society officially denied existed. But the most remarkable aspect of this system was its financial sophistication. You find evidence of medieval prostitutes operating international banking services. They transferred money across borders, extended credit to traveling merchants, and even financed trading ventures. Some brothels functioned as unofficial banks for customers who needed discretion that legitimate financial institutions couldn't provide. The network also moved cultural information, fashion trends, linguistic innovations, and even political intelligence flowed through brothel communications faster than through official channels. Medieval prostitutes were often among the first to learn about diplomatic negotiations, trade agreements, and military movements because their customers included the merchants, soldiers, and officials who made these decisions. A Parisian brothel keeper named Margot de la Barre left records showing that she maintained regular correspondence with colleagues in 12 different cities. Her letters discussed everything from changes in municipal law to recommendations for reliable physicians to warnings about dangerous customers who were traveling between cities. But this international network that had developed over centuries was about to face a threat that would test its resilience like never before. You're witnessing the beginning of the end in 1497 Florence, where a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola stands before a crowd of thousands, calling for the destruction of everything that makes life beautiful, including the women who have served society's needs for centuries. The Protestant Reformation hasn't even begun, but religious reformers are already targeting prostitutes as symbols of everything wrong with medieval Christendom. Savonarola's bonfire of the vanities consumes more than just cosmetics and artwork. You watch as lists of licensed prostitutes are thrown into the flames, as brothel licenses are publicly burned, and as women who have worked legally for decades are suddenly declared enemies of God and state. This isn't just religious fervor. It's the systematic destruction of a regulated industry that had functioned for centuries. The reformist assault on prostitution reveals the deep changes beginning to transform European society. The medieval compromise between church and state, between moral idealism and practical necessity, was crumbling. New forms of Christianity demanded absolute purity instead of managed sin. Rising nation-states wanted direct control over all economic activity instead of the complex licensing arrangements that had evolved over centuries. You follow a group of Florentine prostitutes as they flee the city, carrying what possessions they can salvage. Some head for Rome, where papal authorities still maintain the old arrangements. Others travel north to German cities, where the Reformation hasn't yet taken hold. A few attempt to disappear into respectable society, but their distinctive clothing, their lack of family connections, and their suspicious wealth make them easy targets for persecution. The reformers' success in Florence encouraged similar campaigns elsewhere. In Strasbourg, Protestant authorities closed the municipal brothels and declared prostitution a capital crime. In Geneva, John Calvin's followers established patrols to identify and punish any woman suspected of sexual impropriety. The regulated professional sex work that had characterized medieval cities is being replaced by a moral absolutism that offers no accommodation for human weakness. But the economic consequences of these closures are immediate and devastating. Crime rates soar as frustrated men seek other outlets. Tax revenues disappear, leaving cities scrambling to replace income that had supported everything from bridge maintenance to charity hospitals. Underground prostitution flourishes, but without regulation, it becomes more dangerous and less profitable for everyone involved. The women caught in this transformation face impossible choices. Those with savings attempt to purchase respectability through marriage or religious retirement. Others adapt by becoming increasingly mobile, staying ahead of reform movements that spread across Europe like wildfire. But what you're about to witness is how disease would succeed where moral reform had only partially triumphed. You're standing in the ruins of what was once Vienna's most prosperous brothel in 1504, but the building stands empty because its inhabitants have been consumed by a disease that appeared as if summoned by divine wrath. The Great Pox, what we now call syphilis, has arrived in Europe, and it's rewriting the rules of sexuality, morality, and survival in ways that no one anticipated. The disease first appeared in European ports around 1495, brought by sailors returning from the New World, or possibly spreading from earlier Asian trade routes. Within a decade, it had transformed medieval Europe's carefully regulated sex industry into a landscape of terror. The symptoms were unlike anything medieval physicians had encountered. Pustules that covered the entire body, bones that rotted from within, a madness that could strike years after the initial infection. Medieval medical understanding couldn't explain syphilis, but everyone understood its primary mode of transmission. The disease struck prostitutes first and hardest, then spread to their customers, then to their families. The medieval compromise that had tolerated prostitution as a necessary evil suddenly seemed like a pact with actual devils. Religious reformers proclaimed that God was finally punishing humanity for centuries of sexual license. You examine the medical records kept by Dr. Johann Widmann of Tübingen, one of the first physicians to document the new disease systematically. His notes reveal the chaos that syphilis brought to medieval medical practice. Traditional treatments not only failed, but seemed to accelerate the disease's progression. Mercury, a standard treatment for skin conditions, produced temporary improvement followed by more severe symptoms. The social impact was even more dramatic than the medical consequences. Cities that had licensed prostitution for centuries began closing brothels, not from moral conviction, but from practical terror. Customer demand plummeted as news of the disease spread. The women who survived faced a choice between starvation and continuing to work in an industry that had become synonymous with death. Medieval Europe's response to syphilis revealed the fundamental fragility of the regulated prostitution system. The industry had survived moral condemnation, religious reform, and political upheaval, but it couldn't survive a disease that made its core service potentially lethal. The careful balance between municipal regulation and social tolerance collapsed within a generation. Some cities attempted to adapt by requiring medical examinations, but medieval diagnostic capabilities were inadequate to detect syphilis in its early stages. Others tried to maintain licensed prostitution while forbidding actual sexual contact, an approach that satisfied neither customers nor workers. Most simply abandoned the system entirely. The Great Pox didn't just change prostitution. It transformed medieval sexuality entirely. But for the women whose lives had been built around the old system, this transformation meant something darker than anyone yet realized. You're standing in the ruins of what was once Vienna's most prosperous brothel in 1504, but the building stands empty because its inhabitants have been consumed by a disease that appeared as if summoned by divine wrath. The Great Pox, what we now call syphilis, has arrived in Europe, and it's rewriting the rules of sexuality, morality, and survival in ways that no one anticipated. The disease first appeared in European ports around 1495, brought by sailors returning from the New World, or possibly spreading from earlier Asian trade routes. Within a decade, it had transformed medieval Europe's carefully regulated sex industry into a landscape of terror. The symptoms were unlike anything medieval physicians had encountered. Pustules that covered the entire body, bones that rotted from within, a madness that could strike years after the initial infection. Medieval medical understanding couldn't explain syphilis, but everyone understood its primary mode of transmission. The disease struck prostitutes first and hardest, then spread to their customers, then to their families. The medieval compromise that had tolerated prostitution as a necessary evil suddenly seemed like a pact with actual devils. Religious reformers proclaimed that God was finally punishing humanity for centuries of sexual license. You examine the medical records kept by Dr. Johann Widmann of Tübingen, one of the first physicians to document the new disease systematically. His notes reveal the chaos that syphilis brought to medieval medical practice. Traditional treatments not only failed, but seemed to accelerate the disease's progression. Mercury, a standard treatment for skin conditions, produced temporary improvement followed by more severe symptoms. The social impact was even more dramatic than the medical consequences. Cities that had licensed prostitution for centuries began closing brothels, not from moral conviction, but from practical terror. customer demand plummeted as news of the disease spread. The women who survived faced a choice between starvation and continuing to work in an industry that had become synonymous with death. Medieval Europe's response to syphilis revealed the fundamental fragility of the regulated prostitution system. The industry had survived moral condemnation, religious reform, and political upheaval, but it couldn't survive a disease that made its core service potentially lethal. The careful balance between municipal regulation and social tolerance collapsed within a generation. Some cities attempted to adapt by requiring medical examinations, but medieval diagnostic capabilities were inadequate to detect syphilis in its early stages. Others tried to maintain licensed prostitution while forbidding actual sexual contact, an approach that satisfied neither customers nor workers. Most simply abandoned the system entirely. The Great Pox didn't just change prostitution. It transformed medieval sexuality entirely. But for the women whose lives had been built around the old system, this transformation meant something darker than anyone yet realized. You're following a woman named Catherine through the sewers beneath 1511 Antwerp, and she's leading you into the shadow world that emerged when legitimate prostitution was driven underground. The regulated, guild-organized, municipally licensed system of medieval brothels has been replaced by something far more dangerous, an invisible network of illegal sex work that operates in the spaces between official society. Catherine had been a licensed prostitute for 8 years before the closures began. She owned her own small house, paid her taxes regularly, and had accumulated enough savings to consider retirement. Now she works from abandoned buildings, communicates through coded messages, and charges higher prices to compensate for the increased risks of a legal operation. The underground network functions differently from the old license system. Without official protection, the women depend on criminal organizations for security. You meet a man called Willem who provides protection services for a fee that consumes nearly half the women's earnings. He's not a pimp in the modern sense. He's more like a freelance security contractor, but his services have become essential for survival. Operating illegally has made the work more dangerous, but also more profitable for those who survive. Catherine charges 3 times what she earned in the licensed brothels because scarcity has driven up demand. Customers pay premium prices for discretion and risk. The women who adapt successfully to underground operation often earn more than they did under the old system. But the psychological toll is devastating. Without the social legitimacy the municipal licensing provided, the women face constant anxiety about arrest, violence, and social ostracism. They can't seek help from authorities when customers become violent. They can't access the medical care that licensed brothels had provided. They operate in complete isolation from respectable society. The underground system also attracts a different clientele. The merchants and artisans who frequented licensed brothels are too risk-averse for illegal prostitution. The new customers are often criminals themselves, men who are already outside legal society and have nothing to lose from associating with illegal sex workers. Catherine explains that the women have developed new survival strategies adapted to illegality. They change locations frequently, use false names, and maintain multiple identities. They've learned to identify undercover authorities and developed techniques for avoiding detection. In some ways, they've become more sophisticated than they were under legal regulation. But you can see in Catherine's eyes what this transformation has cost her. The confident businesswoman who once negotiated with municipal officials has become a fugitive who lives in constant fear. What she doesn't know is that the underground system she's learned to navigate is about to face an even greater challenge. You're listening to a sermon in 1517 Wittenberg, where Martin Luther declares that celibacy is unnatural, marriage is sacred, and prostitution is the devil's work. A complete reversal of medieval Catholic teaching that had tolerated commercial sex as a lesser evil. The Protestant Reformation isn't just changing theology. It's revolutionizing sexual morality in ways that will permanently alter European society's relationship with prostitution. Luther's teachings present a radical alternative to medieval sexual economics. Instead of managing sin through regulation, Protestantism promises to eliminate sin through proper channeling of sexual desire within marriage. Instead of tolerating prostitution as socially necessary, Protestant doctrine declares that all sexual expression outside marriage is equally damnable. Whether practiced by prostitutes or princes, the impact on surviving sex workers is immediate and brutal. Protestant cities don't just close licensed brothels. They criminalize any woman suspected of sexual impropriety. In Zurich, authorities establish morality patrols that investigate unmarried women's living arrangements, financial resources, and social associations. A woman living alone, earning unexplained income, or entertaining male visitors faces interrogation, fines, and imprisonment. You witness the transformation of Anna, a former brothel keeper in Strasbourg, as she attempts to adapt to the new moral order. She's married a widowed baker, not for love, but as camouflage for her continued illegal activities. Her bakery serves as a front for clandestine prostitution, but the psychological strain of maintaining respectability while operating criminally is destroying her health and sanity. The Protestant Revolution creates a generation of women trapped between worlds. Those who had built lives around regulated prostitution find themselves classified as irredeemable sinners. Unlike the medieval Catholic system that offered confession and redemption, Protestant doctrine suggests that their corruption is permanent and contagious. Former prostitutes become unmarriageable untouchables in societies that now demand marriage as the only acceptable outlet for sexuality. But the moral revolution also creates unexpected opportunities. Some former sex workers become Protestant reformers themselves, using their intimate knowledge of sin to craft powerful testimonies about redemption. A woman named Magdalena von Habsburg, who had operated brothels in 3 different cities, becomes a prominent preacher whose sermons about sexual purity draw enormous crowds precisely because of her scandalous past. The economic consequences of the moral revolution extend far beyond the sex industry. Cities that had depended on prostitution. Taxes face budget crises. Municipal authorities, who had built careers managing the brothel system, find themselves unemployed. The complex network of suppliers, service providers, and regulators that had supported legal prostitution collapses, creating unemployment that ripples through entire urban economies. Most significantly, the moral revolution changes how society thinks about female sexuality entirely. The medieval world had recognized different categories of women: wives, nuns, and prostitutes, each serving distinct social functions. Protestant morality recognizes only 2 categories: virtuous wives and sinful whores. This binary thinking eliminates the complex middle ground where medieval prostitutes had found social legitimacy. The women caught in this transformation realize they're witnessing the end of an era that had lasted for centuries. The regulated, professional, socially integrated system of medieval prostitution is being replaced by moral absolutism that offers no accommodation for the complexities of human desire. But what none of them anticipate is how the Counter-Reformation will respond to Protestant sexual morality. You're inside the Magdalen House of Rome in 1525. Watching former prostitutes take religious vows as they're transformed into a new category of Catholic saint, the Reformed whore. The Counter-Reformation has discovered that Protestant attacks on Catholic sexual tolerance can be turned into a weapon, but the solution involves sacrificing the women who had once served the Church's interests. The Catholic response to Protestant moral challenges is ingeniously manipulative. Instead of defending the medieval system of regulated prostitution, the Church embraces the conversion of sex workers as proof of Catholicism's superior redemptive power. former prostitutes become living advertisements for Catholic mercy. Their dramatic transformations, offered as evidence that Protestant moral absolutism is unnecessary because Catholic sacraments can cleanse any sin. The Magdalene houses spread across Catholic Europe like a new form of monastery. You watch as women, who had once operated as licensed businesswomen, surrender their possessions, accept religious discipline, and dedicate their lives to prayer and penance. They're celebrated as examples of divine grace, but they're also imprisoned in institutions they can never leave. Their redemption comes at the cost of their freedom. Sister Maria Maddalena, formerly Catherine the prostitute from Antwerp, explains the psychological complexity of her transformation. The Magdalene House offers safety from persecution, regular meals, medical care, and social respectability, benefits that underground prostitution couldn't provide, but it also demands complete surrender of the independence that had defined her previous life. She's traded autonomy for security, and she's not certain she made the right choice. The Counter-Reformation's approach to former prostitutes reveals the Church's sophisticated understanding of public relations. These women's conversions provide spectacular proof of Catholic spiritual power, while eliminating the Protestant criticism that the Church profits from sin. The same institution that had once collected taxes from brothels now collects donations for the redemption of fallen women. But the Magdalene houses also serve a darker function. They remove from society women who possess dangerous knowledge about the hypocrisy of religious and political authorities. Many former prostitutes know secrets about the private lives of bishops, nobles, and merchants that could destroy reputations and careers. Their religious retirement ensures their silence as effectively as execution would, but with better publicity. The women entering these institutions understand they're participating in a performance of redemption that serves institutional needs more than their own spiritual development. But for many, the alternative is starvation, persecution, or worse. The Counter-Reformation offers them a form of survival, even if it's survival as symbols rather than as autonomous individuals. What you're witnessing is the final transformation of medieval prostitutes from regulated workers into religious symbols. But this symbolic status will prove to be another form of exploitation. You're examining the account books of a 1543 Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco, and the numbers tell a story that would have amazed medieval prostitutes. She owns property worth more than most merchants, maintains a private library larger than some monasteries, and charges fees that rival the annual salaries of university professors. The old world of regulated municipal prostitution has been replaced by something entirely different: elite courtesanship that transforms sex work into high art. The economics of Renaissance prostitution operate on completely different principles from the medieval system. Instead of municipal regulation creating standardized pricing and working conditions, individual women now compete in a luxury market, where intelligence, education, and cultural sophistication command premium prices. Veronica charges 50 ducats for a single evening, enough to support a working family for 6 months. But this new system is available only to a tiny elite of exceptionally gifted women. For every successful courtesan like Veronica, hundreds of former prostitutes have been driven into underground poverty or religious institutions. The democratization that characterized medieval municipal brothels, where any woman could earn decent wages through regulated sex work, has been replaced by a winner-take-all system that rewards only the most exceptional performers. You discover that's successful. Renaissance courtesans function as cultural entrepreneurs. Veronica maintains salons where intellectuals discuss philosophy, poetry, and politics. She publishes her own poetry, corresponds with leading scholars, and influences artistic patronage throughout Venice. Her sexuality is just one component of a comprehensive cultural package that includes entertainment, education, and intellectual stimulation. The transformation from medieval prostitute to Renaissance courtesan requires skills that most women don't possess. Veronica speaks 4 languages, writes sophisticated poetry, understands complex theology, and can hold her own in debates about political theory. She's not just selling her body, she's selling her mind, and her prices reflect the rarity of her intellectual gifts. But the new system also creates unprecedented vulnerability. Medieval prostitutes have been protected by guild membership, municipal regulation, and collective bargaining. Renaissance courtesans operate as individual entrepreneurs. Without institutional support, when Veronica's beauty fades or her intellectual fashion changes, she has no safety net except her personal savings and whatever patronage relationship she's cultivated. The account books reveal the anxiety beneath the glamour. Veronica invests heavily in property, artwork, and jewelry, portable wealth. That can provide security if her career ends suddenly. She maintains financial relationships with moneylenders in multiple cities, creating escape routes if Venice becomes dangerous. She's learned to think like a merchant, but she's operating in a market where the primary commodity is herself. The Renaissance transformation of prostitution from regulated labor to elite performance. Art represents both liberation and intensified exploitation. The few women who succeed achieve unprecedented wealth and social influence, but they do so by accepting complete responsibility for their own survival in an increasingly hostile world. What Veronica doesn't realize is that even her elevated status won't protect her from the changes that are about to sweep across Europe. You're hiding in a cellar in 1572 Paris during the Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre, listening to a woman named Isabel explain how religious warfare has made her profession impossibly dangerous. The Protestant-Catholic conflicts tearing Europe apart haven't just changed theology. They've unleashed a new kind of violence against women who exist outside traditional social protection. And prostitutes have become convenient targets for religious fury. The massacre above ground officially targets Protestant heretics, but you learn that many victims are prostitutes, former prostitutes, and women suspected of sexual impropriety. Religious violence provides cover for settling personal scores, eliminating business competition, and expressing frustrations that have nothing to do with theology. Isabel survived because she'd learned to read the signs of impending violence and prepared hiding places throughout the city. The weaponization of moral purity has transformed prostitutes from regulated workers into enemies of God whose elimination is considered virtuous. Catholic mobs justify attacks on Protestant brothels as religious duty. Protestant raiders claim they're purifying Catholic cities by destroying dens of sin. Both sides use sexual morality as propaganda while using violence against sex workers. As entertainment, you watch through a small window as a group of women attempt to flee the city. They're not prostitutes. They're widows, servants, and artisans' wives. But in the chaos of religious warfare, any woman without male protection becomes suspect. The moral categories that once distinguished between virtuous wives and professional prostitutes have collapsed into a simple binary: protected women and vulnerable targets. Isabel shows you the weapons she carries: a small knife, a vial of poison, and most importantly, forged papers identifying her as a respectable widow. She's learned that survival in religious warfare requires multiple identities and the ability to shift between them instantly. The psychological skills that prostitutes developed for managing customers have become essential for navigating sectarian violence. The most disturbing aspect of the religious wars is how they've normalized violence against women as a form of moral cleansing. Soldiers on both sides treat rape and murder of immoral women as rewards for their service to God. The systematic brutalization of sex workers becomes a way of demonstrating religious commitment while satisfying sadistic impulses. Medieval society's complex accommodation of human sexuality has been replaced by moral absolutes that justify unlimited violence against anyone who doesn't conform. The regulated, Professional prostitution that had functioned for centuries has been destroyed not by moral argument, but by physical terror. Isabel explains that the few women who survive religious warfare do so by becoming invisible. They abandon the distinctive clothing, public presence, and social networks that had characterized medieval prostitution. They disappear into underground economies where they serve customers who are themselves fugitives from religious persecution. But what you're about to witness is how this disappearance changes the women themselves in ways that no one anticipated. You're sitting in a tavern in 1598 London with a woman who calls herself Mary, though you suspect that's not her real name. She's explaining how the world that created medieval prostitution has ended, and how women like her have had to remake themselves to survive in a world that denies their existence. The transformation is complete. The regulated, socially integrated sex workers of the medieval world have become the invisible, criminalized underclass of the early modern period. Mary had been a licensed prostitute in Southwark before the Protestant closures. She'd owned property, paid taxes, and expected to retire with dignity after 20 years of legal work. Now she operates from rented rooms, changes her name regularly, and accepts that arrest, violence, or disease will probably end her life before she reaches 40. The social contract that had protected medieval prostitutes has been permanently broken. But Mary has also developed capabilities that her medieval predecessors never needed. She can forge documents, speak multiple languages, and move between social classes with chameleon-like adaptability. The persecution that destroyed the old system has created a new kind of woman, harder, more cunning, and infinitely more resourceful than the guild-protected workers of the medieval period. The conversation reveals how fundamentally the nature of sex work has changed. Medieval prostitutes had been specialist workers in a regulated industry. Early modern prostitutes are survival artists operating in a hostile environment. They've learned to provide services beyond sexuality: information brokering, message carrying, safe house operation, and even espionage. Their marginalization has made them valuable to other marginal populations. Mary explains that the women who survive the transition fall into distinct categories. Some become criminal entrepreneurs, organizing networks of thieves, smugglers, and confidence artists. Others become informal bankers for underground economies. A few become spies, selling information to competing political factions. All have learned that sexuality alone isn't sufficient for survival in the post-medieval world. The psychological toll of this transformation is evident in Mary's manner. She displays the hypervigilance of someone who's lived under constant threat for years. She trusts no one completely, plans multiple escape routes from every situation, and maintains emotional distance even during intimate conversation. The community solidarity that characterized medieval brothels has been replaced by individualistic paranoia, but Mary also possesses a kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving impossible circumstances. She understands power, corruption, and human nature with clarity that would intimidate philosophers. Her illegal status has given her insights into how society actually functions beneath its official moral pretenses. The women who survived the transition from medieval to early modern prostitution became the ancestors of the criminal underworld that would characterize European cities for centuries. They didn't just adapt to illegality. They helped create the structures of organized crime that emerged when traditional social institutions collapsed. Mary finishes her ale and prepares to leave, but she offers one final observation. The medieval world had been brutal in many ways, but it had been honest about human nature. The new world that destroyed medieval prostitution claims moral superiority, while creating conditions far more dangerous for everyone involved. As she disappears into the London night, you realize you've been speaking with a survivor of a social revolution that changed not just prostitution, but the entire relationship between individual desire and social order. You're standing in the ruins of what was once the most elegant brothel in 16th century Rome, now abandoned and crumbling, and you realize you've witnessed the end of a world. The regulated, professional, socially integrated system of medieval prostitution died not from moral evolution, but from the collision of religious warfare, economic transformation, and political centralization that marked the transition from medieval to modern Europe. The story you've followed, from the municipal brothels of medieval cities to the underground networks of the early modern period, reveals how societies construct and destroy the institutions that manage their deepest contradictions. Medieval Europe had developed a sophisticated system for accommodating human sexuality within moral frameworks that officially condemned it. This system worked for centuries, providing economic opportunities for vulnerable women while maintaining social stability for male-dominated societies. But the system's success contained the seeds of its destruction. The wealth and independence that regulated prostitution provided to women challenged traditional gender hierarchies. The international networks that sex workers developed threatened emerging nation-states. Desire for control over population movement, the moral flexibility that made medieval prostitution possible, became incompatible with the religious absolutism that characterized the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. The transformation you've witnessed created the template for how modern societies would handle the contradiction between moral idealism and human desire. Instead of the medieval approach of regulation and accommodation, the post-medieval world chose criminalization and denial. This choice didn't eliminate prostitution. It drove it underground, made it more dangerous, and removed the social protections that had made medieval sex work relatively safe and profitable. The women whose stories you followed, from the guild-organized prostitutes of 15th century cities to the criminal entrepreneurs of the early modern underworld, became the ancestors of marginalized populations that persist to this day. Their experience of transformation from legitimate workers to criminalized outcasts parallels the experience of many groups that find themselves on the wrong side of moral revolutions. The medieval brothel system's destruction also reveals how quickly social institutions that seem permanent can vanish when underlying conditions change. The licensing systems, guild organizations, and municipal regulations that had governed prostitution for centuries disappeared within a single generation when religious, political, and economic pressures aligned against them. Perhaps most significantly, the end of medieval prostitution marked the beginning of the modern world's troubled relationship with sexuality itself. The medieval compromise between moral ideal and practical necessity was replaced by moral absolutism that created the sexual repressions, hypocrisies, and underground markets that would characterize European culture for centuries to come. Today, as societies again debate how to handle sex work, the medieval experience offers both warning and wisdom. It demonstrates that regulation and social integration can provide safety and dignity for vulnerable populations. But it also reveals how quickly social tolerance can collapse when moral panic combines with political opportunity. The women who staffed medieval brothels are long dead, but their ghosts haunt every contemporary debate about sexuality, morality, and social control. Their world ended 5 centuries ago, but the questions it raised about desire, exploitation, and survival remain as urgent today as they were when that first woman in the scarlet hood beckoned you toward a door that opened onto the full complexity of human nature.